The way that I like to think about this is that large language models have reached a point right now where they're very good at some things and not very good at other things, and the limitations of like 70 billion parameters, which is how many sort of is like the size of a model that you can fit on the largest consumer version of a GPU. So like if you're going to go purchase like an A100 or an H100, these are GPUs that cost tens of thousands of dollars. However, what they allow you to do is run on your own machine and fine tuned to your own design a large language model like Llama 2 or something that is on the cutting edge of the open source abilities, basically, and Llama 3 coming out soon. And what that means, cutting edge of open source currently, is basically like GPT 3.5, roughly. So it's not to the level of GPT 4. And the open source, movement is like you said, it's totally decentralized. It's like a bunch of guys, like, not necessarily in their garage at this point, but they're not operating with the same amount of resources, for example, in a consolidated fashion, like an OpenAI or a Microsoft or an Anthropic or any of these larger players are. But if you combine the abilities and the compute of all of them, you beat the big boys. And that's just like Bitcoin, you have the largest supercomputer, and actually, I was going to say this too. The easiest like one liner for BitTensor is it's like Bitcoin for AI, and except instead of guessing a hash and earning a Bitcoin for essentially solving this lottery that secures the Bitcoin network, which is what Bitcoin miners do. That's why they operate their miners and pay for the electricity and the hardware. BitTensor distills intelligence. So it takes a source of intelligence, like a large language model, and it pulls from that another piece of intelligence that is more valuable or that is serving some sort of objective and has some utility in the world. And so that's what BitTensor compute uses, or BitTensor uses compute for. It's to create distilled intelligence, like in the optimal way, in my opinion, of using the platform. Now, when you get back to like how can BitTensor create AGI, this goes back to what we said earlier about forestalling the end of the world. I think the best way that BitTensor can sort of do that is by creating a system whereby the questions that you ask the like large language model that you would normally type into the front end at OpenAI's ChatGPT, instead in BitTensor get routed to one of 32 or one of 64. Eventually, there'll be hundreds of subnets that are specifically designed using this incentive mechanism to be the best at whatever narrow sort of like vertical thing that you're trying to drive the answer into. So like if you're asking about time series prediction, it'll go to that subnet for the S&P 500 or Bitcoin or financial instruments. If you're asking about medical, it'll go to a medical subnet with an LLM that's been specifically designed to, within that certain amount of limited parameters that you can run in an open source model, cram as much medical intelligence into it. Because the way that things work now, the 70 billion parameter model is like a generalist, it's like a Swiss Army knife or something. But what you want is, like, if you ask a question, you want like the machete answer. You don't want like the tiny little knife answer. And the way to get that is to train these models into these sort of narrow alleys of intelligence, and then use the network and leverage this process of iterative improvement across all of these different environments where you have people from all over the world securing the distillation of that intelligence, contributing to like the iterative improvement of those subnets with the ability to generate that information for you. So I see in the future BitTensor operating in that way, is that the network has its operating system, which is a front end basically that you can query. That query then is redirected into any number of subnets that are specialized into answering that specific type of question. And there isn't necessarily at that point a need for an AGI, because anything that you want an answer to is being iteratively improved upon by the incentive mechanism within BitTensor, and also the access to it, like you said before, who owns it. if you hold tau on the BitTensor network and you're a validator, you have access to all of the intelligence on any of the miners, and you can query them at any time. The way that that works is that because I run this validator and I do this process of assessing the ability of the miners to contribute intelligence to the network, they are incentivized to respond to me and all the other validators. This means when somebody from outside of the network sends a query to the IP address for the miner, if they don't recognize them as a validator, they don't respond to it, right? This is what creates the democratization, basically, of the access to the intelligence, is that the validators on the network, and this is what in the end creates the value for the Tau token, um, have now the ability to essentially monetize access to these different intelligence sources through access of the validator holding enough tau that incentivizes the miners to respond to it. And it's rather than it being, one person operating a validator. On my validator, for example, we have, I think, almost 1,100 wallets. So almost 1,100 individuals effectively contributing to our position in the network, which is about 8% or so of the tau that's available, which means that we're one of the top 5 validators when it comes to like getting a response from the mining pools. And as long as you have actors like myself and the other validators who are incentivized through this mechanism of outside sources of their own wallet contributing to the size of the validator, that means that I'm now incentivized to share that intelligence with everybody else. And that's what breaks this whole like shareholder mentality of the corporate world of we must make more money for our shareholders any way possible. In the BitTensor world, it's we must make the access to intelligence as open as possible as a validator in order to garner even more support from the community at large in the form of delegating their tau to our validator to grow its access to the mining pool.